I want you to think about the last time you begged for something from someone who should have offered it freely. Maybe it was attention. Maybe it was consistency. Maybe it was just the basic reassurance that you mattered to them, that you were a priority, that choosing you was something they did on purpose. And I want you to think about what it felt like to need that so much that you were willing to ask for it, again and again, in different ways, with different words, with tears sometimes, with anger sometimes, with silence, hoping the silence would say what the words never could. If you know what I'm describing, if you have lived in that cycle of reaching and receiving nothing and reaching again, this video is for you. Because I want to tell you about the day I stopped and what I found when I did. Let me begin with something that took me a long time to understand. Begging for love does not always look like begging. It does not always look like tears on the kitchen floor or desperate late-night messages. Most of the time, it looks completely ordinary. It looks like making yourself more available than you actually want to be, like agreeing to things that do not feel right because disagreeing might cost you his attention, like working harder to be easier to love, funnier, less needy, less complicated, less yourself. Begging for love is the slow, daily work of making yourself smaller in hopes that the smaller version of you will finally be the version he chooses to show up for. Carl Jung would call this the collapse of the persona, the exhausting performance of becoming whoever you think the other person needs you to be, at the cost of who you actually are. And the terrible paradox of it is that it never works. Not because you are not lovable, but because no one can truly love a performance. You can admire a performance, you can enjoy it, but love requires someone real. And when you are performing, the real you is somewhere backstage, waiting to be allowed on stage. Jung was very clear about where this pattern originates. It does not come from weakness. It comes from a specific wound that most people carry without ever being able to name it. The wound of conditional love. Conditional love is love that arrives with terms attached. You are loved when you are good. You are loved when you do not cause problems. You are loved when you are achieving, performing, meeting expectations. But the love withdraws, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, when you are too much or not enough, or simply yourself in ways that are inconvenient. Children who grow up with conditional love learn a devastating lesson. They learn that love is not something they inherently deserve. It is something they must earn. And the way you earn it is by becoming whatever the other person needs you to be. This lesson becomes encoded so deeply in the nervous system that most people carry it into every significant relationship of their lives without ever questioning it. So when they find themselves performing, adapting, shrinking, it does not feel like a pattern. It feels like love. It feels like effort. It feels like what you do when you care about someone. Jung said, "What is most personal is most universal." And nothing is more personally devastating or more universally experienced than growing up believing that your worth is something you have to prove every single day. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow to describe the parts of ourselves we have hidden away because they were not safe to express. For women who grew up with conditional love, the shadow often holds the very things that make them most human: their needs, their desires, their right to take up space without justification. Because very early on, they learned that expressing a need was risky. Maybe the need was met with impatience. Maybe it was dismissed. Maybe it caused conflict. And conflict for a child who depends on those around them for survival is not something you risk lightly. And so the needs went underground. They became part of the shadow. And the person learned to survive by giving rather than receiving, by anticipating what others needed before they had to ask, by being helpful, by being easy, by being the person who never caused problems. But the shadow, Jung insisted, never stays quiet forever. The needs do not disappear. They come out sideways as resentment, as overgiving followed by collapse, as the specific pain of begging for something from someone who does not even know they are supposed to be giving it. Because how can they know what you need if you have spent your whole life learning to hide it? The moment I stopped begging was not dramatic. It did not arrive as a revelation or a breakdown or a final confrontation. It arrived as exhaustion. I remember the exact quality of it, not the exhaustion of someone who has been running and needs rest. The exhaustion of someone who has been running in the wrong direction for so long that they have forgotten what they were running toward. And in that exhaustion, a question surfaced that I had never allowed myself to ask. What if I am not the problem? Not in a defensive way, not as a way of blaming him, but genuinely. What if the issue is not that I am not lovable enough, not consistent enough, not small enough, not easy enough, but that I have been trying to earn something from someone who does not have it to give? Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious, conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The begging was not my fate. It was my unconscious running a program that was installed in childhood and had never been examined. The moment I examined it, the moment I brought it into the light, and it began to lose its power. When a woman stops begging for love, several things happen simultaneously, and not all of them feel good at first. The first thing that stops is the hope, the specific hope that this time will be different. That, if you just explain it better, ask more clearly, need it less desperately, he will finally understand. He will finally show up. He will finally become the person you have been loving toward all this time. Losing that hope is one of the most painful things a woman can experience, because that hope was not just about him, it was about the story where love, if given generously enough, transforms people, where patience is always rewarded, where effort is always recognized. Letting go of that story feels like a kind of death. And it is. It is the death of an illusion. And illusions, even the ones that were hurting you, are genuinely hard to lose. But here is what begins to grow in the space that the illusion occupied. Clarity. The ability to see the situation as it actually is, not as you hoped it would become. Energy. The energy that was being poured into the performance, the managing, the hoping, that energy comes home. And you discover how much of it there is when it is no longer being spent on someone who was not receiving it, and something else, something harder to name, but immediately recognizable once it arrives: self-respect. When I stopped begging, I did not immediately find peace. I found myself, and that is different. Finding yourself after a long period of self-abandonment is not comfortable. It is confronting. Because the self you find has needs, real ones, not the watered-down version you allowed yourself when you were trying not to be too much. The self you find has opinions, standards, preferences that are not negotiable in exchange for being chosen. And the self you find is, if you let yourself look at her honestly, extraordinary. Jung called this process individuation. The becoming of the whole self, not the self that was shaped by wounds or by other people's limitations, the self that exists beneath all of that, the one that was always there, waiting patiently for you to stop auditioning and simply arrive. And what I discovered, what every woman discovers when she stops begging and starts simply being, is that the love she was searching for was never missing from her life. It was missing from her relationship with herself. The love she was asking him to give her was the love she had never learned to give herself. The attention she craved was the attention she had been withholding from her own inner life for years. The choosing she was desperate for was the choosing she had been avoiding. The terrifying, liberating act of choosing herself. I want to be honest with you about what happens after you stop begging. Not every relationship survives it. Some relationships were built on the architecture of your smallness, on the dynamic of you reaching and him deciding whether to respond. When you stop reaching, that architecture collapses, and sometimes the relationship collapses with it. But here is what I want you to know. A relationship that could only survive your smallness was never going to give you what you were actually hungry for. What you were hungry for was to be loved as yourself, fully, without performance, without the constant anxiety of wondering whether today is the day he decides you are too much. That love exists, but it cannot find you while you are still performing for a different audience. Stop begging, start being, and trust with everything you have that the woman you actually are is more than enough to be loved without condition. If this video reached you, if something in what I said landed in a place you have been protecting, write "no more" in the comments. 2 words, that is enough. I read everyone. And if this is your first time here, this channel is called She Awakened. We explore Jungian psychology for women who are learning to understand their own patterns deeply enough to finally break them. Subscribe and share this with any woman who is still begging for something she already deserves.